911, emergency, police, fire, medical.
1,500 times a day on average, 911 operators ask that question on the front lines of a response when there's an emergency in Rhode Island. More than 500,000 calls last year came here to the statewide E911 center housed in the state police headquarters complex in Scituate. Then were routed to the appropriate local agency. It's a high-stress job where seconds matter, literally, especially if somebody's having a heart attack or a burglar is breaking into a house.
Employees matter, that you put people, you have to answer that phone.
Rhode Island State Police Colonel Stephen O'Donnell also oversees the State Department of Public Safety and the E911 system. But 911, which every cell phone and landline owner helps fund through a monthly surcharge, has seen a steady decrease in manpower since it was established in 1988. At the same time, the number of calls put on hold has increased 25% the past 4 years. The Hummel report first looked at the issue in 2011, discovering that 13,000 calls that year went into queue, the agency's term for put on hold. Some for as little as 2 seconds, the longest 2 minutes, and the average just under 12 seconds. Now, 12 seconds might not seem like a lot, but during an emergency...
You have reached 911. Please stay on the line.
And we profiled a local restaurant owner who couldn't get through to 911 when one of her customers fell and hit her head. She gave up and dialed the Smithfield Police Department directly, like we all did before 911.
I said, I don't know what's going on, but thank God I didn't have an armed gunman in here shooting someone, and I only had one phone call, and it was to 911, and no one answered.
The situation has gotten worse. Last year, more than 16,000 calls were put on hold. That's an average of 45 a day, and up more than 3,000 calls from 4 years ago.
And there's an expectation, if you call 911, you're not put on hold. That would be an expectation of everybody. The reality is sometimes people are.
Colonel O'Donnell says 911 does an exceptional job under the circumstances, noting that the calls put on hold account for only 3% of last year's 511,000 calls, and that some of them come when there's a major emergency and multiple people are calling in simultaneously about the same problem.
If you have a call for, say, a serious motor vehicle accident, you may get 25 calls. And so the volume of calls, if you have 6 telecommunicators, is just the way it works.
But the numbers tell the story. When 911 was established nearly 27 years ago, there were 60 telecommunicators to handle 100,000 calls. A decade ago, the manpower was down to 44. And the past several years, it's been 29 operators to handle 5 times the original number of calls. Although the center can accommodate up to 14 telecommunicators, sometimes there have been as few as 5 on a given shift. On the day we visited last week, there were 6 on duty, plus a supervisor.
10 years ago, they had more than 40 telecommunicators taking calls down there. Did you know that?
I do.
And so now we're down 10 or 11. How does that happen?
Well, it's the consistent doing more with less across the board statewide. It really has nothing to do with public safety. Every year, since I've been the colonel and even as a lieutenant colonel, we prepare budgets. And some way you got to cut. If you're over budget, you have to cut. So
but if you had, and I understand all of that, if you had 40 people down there right now, do you think these numbers would be dramatically less?
Oh, of course. Yeah, I mean, numbers change. Numbers would change calls in queue.
In order to handle the calls, the department has had to call back telecommunicators for forced overtime. One told us 4 years ago he couldn't handle the stress of watching calls go on hold repeatedly and ultimately left his job. This year, the surcharge we all pay on cell phones and landlines will bring in more than $17 million. But 911 is only getting $5.4 million of that, because the General Assembly years ago eliminated so-called restricted receipt accounts. In other words, the money goes into the general fund and 911 has to fight for its budget every year along with every other department. It wasn't supposed to be that way.
One way or another, it goes to the general fund or public safety. I want to point out that the public safety total budget's closer to $90 million. That's got to be paid for one way or another.
We sat down with House Speaker Nicholas Mattiello on Tuesday. The Speaker said he has confidence in the 911 system and relies on Colonel O'Donnell's recommendations every year at budget time.
We will consider their budget request in this legislative session, and we'll make sure that it's appropriately funded. And that'll be a collaboration between public safety and our finance committee.
If it was originally intended for 911, should the state be charging people for something that the money's really going somewhere else? It wasn't established for public safety or state police or anything else. It was 911.
That's a different issue. We're not going to build a 911 system that's bigger than it needs to be, that's inefficient or inappropriate. Whether or not we should reconsider how the fees that we charge on it, that's a totally different issue. And of course, we'll always look at all of those issues.
Colonel O'Donnell says 5 new telecommunicators are coming on board this week, but there's a 6-month training period to get them fully up and running. And there is no net gain in employees, as 911 recently lost 3 people and was already down several more that had not been funded.
We're $170 million short in the state. So somewhere there has to be cuts. If it's 911, Fire Marshal, State Police, DPS, or the other agencies that submit requests, if there was extra money out there, everybody would be looking to put it towards their people. What's a priority? So I think the legislature has to figure out what's a priority from all the different agencies and what can work best in different agencies.
So if you call 911 and hear this,
You have reached 911. Please stay on the line.
now you'll know why your call is going on hold.
In a perfect world, I'd like to see 0. I think as a superintendent of state police and the commissioner of public safety, nobody should be put on hold. That would be but the reality is sometimes people really are.
In Scituate, Jim Hummel for the Hummel Report.